Welcome to Europe Debates. My name is Richard Milsom and I'm the Director of the European Conservatives and Reformist Party in Brussels. This is the 8th in our series of webinars. As always, we're pleased to welcome viewers from across the world joining us from Twitter, Facebook and YouTube, and of course ECRparty.eu. When the coronavirus crisis closed down our societies, the one aspect of daily life that didn't come to a halt was trade. Goods continued to move across the globe and shops remained fully stocked. The European Commission even at one point removed barriers on the import of medical products to avoid hindering their movement. Yet despite this success, we as Conservatives are facing tough opposition from the collectivist left when it comes to promoting free trade. Those who oppose free trade would rather see everything controlled from the centre and by the state. Because of this opposition, goods can still not pass freely between two of the world's largest economies, the United States and the European Union. Talks to remove these barriers have stalled. To discuss these barriers and what the future holds for transatlantic trade, I'm joined by our esteemed panel of experts and politicians today. Now, moderating our discussion is Daniel Hannan, a former member of the European Parliament, commentator, journalist and author, and as a co-founder of the Vote Leave campaign, he's one of the architects of the British withdrawal from the European Union and a formidable advocate for free trade through his foundation, the Institute for Free Trade. As a former Secretary General of the ECR Party, it's great to have him and to welcome him here to moderate this debate today. As I pass over to Dana, as I just said, that the webinar is live streamed across different platforms, and we're very grateful for the hundreds of people that have registered and will be following this debate live. Please do use the comment section to ask questions, which I will relay to the panel. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Daniel.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. Always nice to be back with the ECR. And I want to plunge straight in without lengthy introduction, so I will give it a brief intro to each of our distinguished panelists when first calling on him to speak. Before we turn our minds to the question of free trade and how we as free marketeers deal with the barriers, physical, commercial, and psychological that have gone up in response to the epidemic, I want to, because of the rather apt range of different countries represented on today's panel, just to get a little sense of how the lockdowns and the other prohibitions have worked in different countries. And I want to start with Sweden. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Mattias Karlsson, former leader of the Sweden Democrats Party, a member of parliament in Sweden, recently stood back to run a think tank called Oikos, which stands, Oikos being the Greek for home, stands, if you like, for the Burkean ideal of moderate conservative patriotism. And Mattias, Sweden, every day, I think this is probably true whichever country people are watching in, every day we read two different stories about Sweden. One says everything is vindicated and the chief epidemiologist of Sweden is completely satisfied that things have worked out as planned. And the other one says, no, the death rate in Sweden is much higher than in neighboring Nordic countries. Of course, both of these things could be true if the fatality rate is more squashed up. But you are there as, I should stress, an opposition politician. It's a socialist government that very unusually, pretty much uniquely in Europe, did not impose any formal lockdown beyond some very mild restrictions of big gatherings. How does it look sitting where you are?
The situation is very complicated and the debate is very heated at the moment. What we can see is that we seem to have managed a little bit better than our neighbors when it comes to the economy. But it's also true that for the last period, we had the highest death rate per capita in the world. And especially the debate is around whether or not we could have protected our elderly more, because a great portion of the people who have died have been people in state-owned or communally owned elderly care centers, and where we actually control people coming in and out. And that is where the big disaster has been and where the big debate is at the moment. I'm not sure if the state epidemiologist have withdrawn his previous statements or that he has said that the strategy was a failure, but he has made some excuses. He said that we could have done more, and so forth. But he's not saying that Sweden should have gone into lockdown.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for being so brief. Right, I'm going to go from one extreme in policy terms to the other. I'm going to now turn to Spain and to my friend Herman Tertsch. And I should say in introducing Herman that despite being called Herman Tertsch and despite speaking very good English, he is authentically Spanish. Indeed, a very patriotic and a knowledgeable Spaniard, the best kind of patriot who favors the freedom and independence of all countries. A colleague of mine in the European Parliament and a great critic of the left radicalism that is sweeping Latin America in particular. Now, Herman, you are, like Matthias, in an opposition right-of-centre party. That, by the way, is quite unusual in Europe. Spain and Sweden are quite rare in having traditional socialist parties in government. But whereas the Swedish socialist government didn't lock down at all, Spain was quite early and quite restrictive compared to other countries and has stayed in lockdown for longer than some. So do you think, I mean, would you rather have had a Swedish approach in retrospect, or do you think that it was effective to impose this general quarantine?
Thank you, Dan, for your words. Well, I think in any case, our solution was probably the worst of all, because we were late. We were not early. We were very late because the whole information about the extension of the contagious disease in Spain was there. They knew it was already inside and in this contagious process, and they didn't say anything. They asked people not to wear masks. They wanted to hide at any cost everything, because they had their demonstrations on the 8th of March. The 8th of March was, that's a little bit a parallel to this 1st of May, about these parades in Chernobyl, when Chernobyl happened. That there were some kind of festivities, socialist festivities, and they didn't want to say anything, so people turned to. And that's what actually happened in Spain. And so they asked people to go to the demonstration on the 8th of March. You had this demonstration, which were a catastrophe, because the 2 weeks before the demonstrations, the whole contagion went out. And so then on the 9th, just hours after the feminist demonstrations, they start with the alarm, and then the state of alarm days later, and then we had the lockdown. And the confinement was the absolute confinement, three months of absolute total police controlled, in a very, very harsh way, controlled confinement, which gives you almost a taste of a very, very, very big and extensive repression of every kind of individual position against this or disobedience. And so on, with fines, very heavy fines to everybody who was disobeying and so on. But this confinement, which was absolute, and as I say, it's very, very long, 90 days, it brought us the complete collapse of the trade and of the businesses and the economy itself. So we are in a state of the state of alarm. The sanitary medical state of alarm was finished, but now we are in a state of alarm and economical state of alarm. The collapse they are speaking about of the national gross product, probably we could fall even to the 20%. We are speaking about really monstrous figures on disemployment, unemployment, and closing of shops, of businesses, of hotels. The whole touristic sector is in an absolute disastrous situation, in an alarming situation. And we don't know really what is going to happen. This government is only there trying to survive and getting his majority with his left-wing extreme groups. And so it will be enormously difficult. But seeing Sweden, I can only say, comparing, that Sweden has now probably the deaths we had during all this months. But if the economy resists in a better shape, I think we didn't spare the deaths. We have officially we have 28,000 deaths. In reality, we have over 45,000 deaths. We have by far the worst casualty rate, a mortal casualty rate of the whole world per million of inhabitants. We are the first, and even so, the government is cheating with the numbers every day, and they are hiding. So I would say if Sweden comes slowly out of the crisis now, the Swedish, even being very risky, the Swedish solution has been better.
Thank you very much, Herman. And I mean, this disparity of how different countries count their figures makes all these international comparisons very difficult. Nonetheless, I want to come now to Eduardo Bolsonaro in Brazil. Bom dia, Eduardo, because Brazil is, I think, at the top of the list of left-wing bogeymen. Our late colleague in my former colleague in the European Parliament, Herman's current colleague, Guy Verhofstadt, recently tweeted, "Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, Boris Johnson, leaders of the infected world." And I think, I think Bolsonaro is at the top of that list because he was already, a bit like we saw with the forests in the Amazon, it was all personally his fault, But I just want to ask again how it feels to you. I should say in introducing you, Eduardo Bolsonaro, member of parliament for the PSL, the Conservative Party in Brazil, member of parliament for São Paulo, re-elected, I think this is true, in 2015 with a record personal vote, more than 2 million votes. So how does it feel sitting where you are, Eduardo? Are people dropping in higher numbers than in the rest of South America?
Thank you for the opportunity, Daniel. Hi, Herman, Groover, all the others. Nice to see some of you again. And this is a very, very simple answer, Daniel, because the problem in Brazil is that we elected a conservative president, but we don't have any conservative media, conservative, the structure behind the president. So what we are facing here is that everything goes into politics, even the COVID. And for sure it's happening everywhere. If you look to Brazil and to US, you're going to see that the lockdowns are really strong where you have socialist governors. And it's very important to say that here in Brazil, right in the beginning of the pandemic, our Supreme Court said that the president, Jair Bolsonaro, he didn't have any kind of power to say how it would be the lockdowns. Who decide about lockdowns and all the other conditions about the quarantines are the governors and the mayor of the cities. So President Jair Bolsonaro, he doesn't have nothing with that. He says that he wants to reopen the economy, people is going to die because slavery is coming, and no one's care about that much. For the politicians here, it's much better to say that let's go close everything and take care about your life. I want you to be healthy. But in the end of the day, if you look, this governor, he's full of food inside of his home. And the people in Brazil, they don't have reserves. And another thing that is very important to say here is that the Congress approved a new law saying, Daniel, that when the governors from the state, when they receive less money from the taxes, I mean state taxes, the federal government, Jair Bolsonaro, is going to pay this difference. So the governors, they are very, how can I say that? They are very calm. They can do lockdowns like forever, because who is going to pay this bill is the president, not the governors. So they are kind of irresponsible when you talk about a lockdown. So this is pretty much the situation in Brazil. We have big numbers of people dying for sure. We are 210 million people. But if you look to the proportional numbers, when you consider the 210 million people that are living in Brazil, you're going to see that it's not that bad. But we do not control the media, and for sure the media is controlled in pretty much big part of the Western Hemisphere by the left wings.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eduardo. And let me reassure you that an absence of conservative media and universities is in no sense a peculiarity of Brazil. I think it's something that most of our panelists will recognize in their countries of origin. Just before we leave COVID and come on to trade, I wanted to come to Grover, and particularly on the equivalent of that last point that Eduardo was just making, that it's the responsibility of the individual governors in Brazil. Of course, similarly, the United States, a federal system, each state could pursue its own approach, quite rightly. Now, is it the case, as we read, that in some of the southern red states, we are now seeing a large pickup in numbers of infections as a result of premature reopenings by Republican governors? Or is it the case, as Donald Trump says, that this is just because they're testing more, or that there are other numerical discrepancies? How does it look to you sitting in DC? I should say Grover Norquist, leader of the most effective of all American pressure groups, the Americans for Tax Reform, which has got almost every good congressman to sign up to it, and whose Wednesday meetings are an absolute must for every conservative passing through DC. Forgive me, I should have said it at the start. Grover.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we do have the 50 states making decisions, and we watched New York make the decision to take people out of hospitals, put them in old folks' homes, and thousands more people died than ever would have been necessary. Massive bad decisions by a Democrat governor in New York, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, Minnesota. A number of states made the same mistake. And the press doesn't want to talk about that. They talk about how well that governor's done, which is a little annoying to the other governors, Florida and Texas, which have both had much lower rates of deaths and have been opening up. They come and say, well, you know, there are lots of a spike in deaths. No, deaths are going down. In the southern states, deaths are down. The number of people going to ICU units, intensive care units, the thing you worry about running out of space and ending up with what was reported in Italy, that 100 people come in and there are only 50 ventilators, respirators, and you have to do triage. We never hit that in the United States, not in any city, not in any state. We flattened the curve. And we're now looking at opening up. And the left is very unhappy because this is all being seen through the prism of the November election. And the blue state governors are trying to slow down the growth of the economy in order to argue that the Bush tax cuts didn't work, the Trump tax cuts didn't work, the Trump deregulation didn't work, lousy economy, vote him out. We are seeing some increase in infections in the Southwest, which may be the more porous border with Mexico. That is something to look at. That may actually be more people getting sick. But the key measure is how many are dying, how many are hospitalized. With more testing, you are seeing that more people have a mild version of COVID-19. That you are collecting. The numbers are not spiking on deaths or people going into intensive care in the states that have been opening more. But because there are 50 states and we have months until the election, you will hear people screaming the world is ending in Florida a month or two ago, and then they started again. Whenever something ticks up, they pick one of 7 different numbers, and the one that ticks up, that's the one that we should care about today, at least in Florida, but not in other states. It'll go on and on and on. We have enough time until the election to get through it, but you do see some governors getting scared, pulling back on how quickly they open up, and that will slow the return to a stronger economy.
And do you think, Grover, I'm sure I won't be the only person watching who's interested in this, do you think that the Republican convention will go ahead in Florida as planned? And do you think that we, overseas friends of the United States and of American democracy, will be allowed to travel in order to attend it?
I certainly hope that you will be able to travel. They're going to have 2 conventions, one where people sit in rooms and decide things like the platform and party business, and they can sit 6 feet away and you can, Skype in or whatever. But then there'll be the larger rally, probably in an outdoor facility in Jacksonville. And so you'll see large events, many speakers, future presidential candidates, Republican leaders, people running for the House and Senate who need to be on television at night because they're making the case in their own states. That will move forward in Jacksonville, and depending on how things are feeling as we go into August, it'll be more open or less.
And I finally have to ask, because a lot of people will be wondering, what is the image of the burning building behind you?
That is the Burning Man that burns every year in northern Nevada. About 80,000 people get together, build a city in the desert, Black Rock City. It is small L, libertarian, self-government. People build a city with roads and they, their own little buildings and a great deal of art. And then we burn it all.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Rather like the Festival of the Fallas in Valencia. Very good.
Yeah.
So thank you all for that, that brief overview of where we are on the lockdowns. I now want to come to the meat of what we're talking about for the remaining 3/4 of an hour. And I want now to come to Philip, who has produced a report or an update on the state of trade and trade barriers in the world. And rather than anticipating it, why don't you just tell us, Philip, what it is, and we can then turn that into a wider conversation.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the ECR Party for convening an excellent panel between North America, South America, and Europe. It's a really important time to be talking about trade. Tomorrow, the US, Mexico, and Canada, we're implementing the new USMCA agreement. And in the pipeline, we have agreement with the UK, with the EU. The EU has an agreement with Mercosur, and hopefully the US will have one too before the end of the year. We saw a problem when we talk about trade, especially in public discourse. There's a lot of distraction towards the value of trade, the volume of trade goods, surpluses and deficits. There's also a lot of political gamesmanship. And so we wanted to create a tool that would help focus. The whole point of our free trade agreements, the GATT and the WTO, is on reducing trade barriers that really protect our human right to be able to trade our goods and services with other people across borders on our own terms. So we created the Trade Barrier Index. It looks at the 3 most direct forms of trade barriers. Those are tariffs, non-tariff measures, services restrictions, and then the 4th component looks at the behind-the-border measures that are necessary to allow trade to happen. So things like property rights, digital restrictions, logistics performance, and we also look at the membership in regional trade agreements. That was one of the more controversial points in the free trade community, because ideally we'd like countries to reduce barriers unilaterally instead of wait for a partner to come along and negotiate those. It's sort of like a hostage situation to negotiate those barriers away. But over the last decades, most trade barriers have really been reduced through those trade agreements. But you have to have sort of a Goldilocks scenario for that to happen. You need a executive and a legislature and all the party governments to be able to look at concessions on trade barriers and increased market access as opportunities rather than threats. And this may be where we have an impasse right now between the United States and Europe, between Mercosur and Europe, that there's not a large coalition and the other parties that looks at trade as opportunity and instead rather as threats. So in addition to the data that allows you to compare how countries are using trade barriers, we have great correlations. So countries with lower trade barriers experience much higher rates of per capita income, rates of liberty, prosperity. Countries with lower trade barriers, with higher trade barriers, have much higher rates of perceived corruption, much higher rates of abuse of the press. It's hard to see, for instance, if Brazil could have had the Petrobras scandal if there was competition with foreign firms, with state-owned enterprises. We also feature case studies from different countries on that can illustrate more than the numbers can on the costs of trade barriers. For instance, we have a case study from Center for Indonesian Policy Studies on the price of rice. They used all types of trade barriers on rice. There's tariffs. You need an import license. Only one state-owned enterprise is allowed to import, and they need the government to give them permission. There's a bunch of SPS controls on the quality of rice. So Indonesia experiences some of the highest rates of stunted growth and malnutrition because the staple product is so expensive. So they explain in their case study how that comes together. There's another case study from Sri Lanka on the price of women's feminine products, that it was 100% equivalent tariff with the tariffs and other taxes to import these products. So women would end up staying home and not going to school, not going to work. So there's all these negative trickle-down effects to all these barriers. We also have a case study from the Cato Institute on the Jones Act that looks at the restriction on using foreign ships to transport products between states. So it's so expensive to find a ship to transport cows from Hawaii to the mainland for processing that farmers, where they have a large cattle industry, they have to send them on airplanes rather than on boats because there's no Jones Act compliance ships. So those are some of the ways that we can use the trade barrier index to look at how we compare across countries, the correlations, and our case studies.
Okay. So thank you. I'm going to interrupt you because I want to put a question to you in the first place, Philip. But then, please, the other panelists, please just raise your hand if you want to come in on this. And the question is this: what you have just said, Philip, is I think pretty empirically demonstrable, right? The countries with the lower trade barriers get rich quicker than the countries that have residual commercial blocks. And that is true whether you compare the same country at different periods or parallel countries over the same period. But this is a difficult argument to win, even in normal times. Free trade is counterintuitive. It runs up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genomes. And the mercantilist or protectionist case rests on a series of assertions that sound completely plausible. So whether it's in Beijing or in Brussels or indeed with Donald Trump, when a protectionist says something like, we can't carry on with a trade deficit like this, or we can't compete with countries that have slave wage economies, or we need to protect industries, or we mustn't import too much of our food. All of those things sound completely plausible. It requires a little bit of understanding to see that all of them actually, if pursued, make a country poor. That, as I say, is a difficult argument to make even in normal times. But an epidemic flicks switches in our brains. It throws us back on our basic Paleolithic algorithms. Food, keep your kids close, turn inwards, avoid strangers, they may carry pathogens. And when that is translated into politics in a modern society, it usually takes the form of quarantine people coming in, close the borders, grow more of our own food. How many times have I heard that, over the last 3 months? Surely even you, Hannon, now can see that it's dangerous that we're importing 40% of our food. Do you know what? The opposite, right? What this is, if you think about it logically, what this crisis has shown us is how valuable imports are, right? In Britain, the epidemic hit at the height of what farmers call the hungry gap. So April is when we've run out of the winter crops. We're not producing any more carrots or turnips or potatoes or cabbages, but we haven't yet reached the first harvest, right? We are totally dependent on imported food. And that was exactly when, we would have been living just on rhubarb and asparagus otherwise. But global food markets functioned beautifully. My worry is, I think that even, like I say, even before, that was a tough argument to make. And now I really sense that the ground is slipping away. So a general question, I'll start with you, Philip, but to the others as well. Is this just ground that free traders need to cede? Or is there a way that we can come back and win some of these arguments?
I think we need to be more vocal, and we can focus on specific products or specific industries. I'm reminded of when we passed NAFTA in 1994, there was a large contingent of farmers in Southern California that grow avocados, and they thought imports from Mexico were going to run them out of business. But instead, what happened, because they grow avocados all year round in Mexico, there's a huge increase in supply. This luxury fruit, I think it's a fruit, and the price went down. And so they became like a staple product for everybody. All our millennials are eating avocado toast. So those farmers in California, they never went out of business. Instead, they have more demand than ever before because it's something that is on everybody's plate. When at the height of, I think, the COVID fear, we had Simon Evident at Global Trade Alert. He tracked 68 governments imposing 82 export restrictions on medical products, protective equipment that everybody needs. But today there's a report in the Wall Street Journal that a third of those are down. But let's say this is vice versa. These trade networks is how we get these solutions into the hands of our doctors, our nurses, and our people. And when we have the next treatments, the next vaccines, they're going to go through those same networks. So those countries that are part of those global supply chains, it seems like more than countries that are isolated, they'll be part of the production, part of the innovation, and part of the markets that are able to get those solutions.
Thank you. I wonder, Eduardo, if I could put a related question to you. I had the great pleasure of visiting Brasilia about a year ago and meeting both the foreign minister and the finance minister. And I was incredibly enthused by their readiness to contemplate serious and, when necessary, unilateral removal of trade barriers and other economic barriers. And I came away very, very excited by the prospects of Brazil, this slumbering giant that underperformed during 20 years or more of socialist government, and that finally seemed to be about to rise and shatter its chains. But I wonder how much of that is going to be possible in a world where trade generally is falling, where people are becoming more suspicious, where the USMCA, which Philip mentioned, is a good thing, but it's probably less ambitious than NAFTA was. Are you going slightly, do you feel, against the global current, or do you think you can still pioneer economic liberalization?
Here in Brazil, you're right, Daniel. We had around 30 years of socialist government. So after everything, as Thompson just said, we had so much scandals with our public companies. We had so much policies that, in the end of the day, you don't have people they are still poor. So after 30 years, they just realized that, all right, we have to try something different. So that's why Paulo Guedes is having so much success. And I can tell you that we have a great future, because the main reform, the most sensitive one, it was the pension reform. And we approved the pension reform last year. And not only approved it in the Congress. The Congress, for example, in the House where I work, and you are right, Daniel, I'm the most voted representative of ever in the history of Brazil. We approved it with almost, thank you, we approved this pension reform in the House with almost 400 votes. And we have 513 representatives. So it shows a lot the support of the people. You have people in the streets asking for the pension reform, and asking for the pension reform with the toughest one, the one that was proposed by Mr. Paulo Guedes, our economy ministry, not the other pension reforms that some representatives or senators want to do with more flexibilizations, you know. So we are living this moment in Brazil now. So we have all the tools to keep going. And unhappily, we have the pandemic now, but we were supposed to have here now the debates about the tax reform. So after the pandemic, for sure, this issue is going to be back in the Congress to debate. And I really believe that we are going to approve that. And if you look, just to finalize my speech, if you look for the agreement between Mercosur and European Union, it was stopped for around 20 years. So what happened? In a couple of months, with Jair Bolsonaro as president, and Jair Bolsonaro only said something. He's very humble. He said, I don't know nothing about economy. I'm a captain for the army. I know about war, about the security, about the borders, but about economy, 100% is going to be up to Mr. Paulo Guedes, our economy minister. So this is why we are having so much success here. And after you have these new policies, people start to trust that socialism is not the way to the prosperity. The way of the prosperity is free market, respect the freedom of the people, the liberties, and everything that is right the opposite of the left-wing people say.
Yes, very, very king. I mean, I spent a day in your finance ministry, and it's as though people had gone to Grover's Institute or to the Cato Institute or similar, and had just recruited the entire staff and said, "Here's a large G20 country. You know, make it rich." I've really never come, even in the Thatcher and Reagan times, I don't think there was ever such a concentration of involved and active free marketeers engaged in positions of influence. So it's you know, everybody is wishing you well. Grover, let me ask you something as a wily old observer of the US scene. You've been singing the same song, you know, since long before some of us were in politics. You know, your institute was founded, I think, in the earlier Reagan times, and when you were going in the 80s, it was fairly mainstream for Republicans to be in favor of reducing trade barriers and taking obstacles out of the way between businesses and their customers, whichever country they were in. And it was also pretty mainstream for Republicans to want to cut the benefits bills and reduce the cost of state welfare. Now, I get the impression that that is much less true today than it was then. And that, if you like, classical liberalism is a much more minority position than it was in the US, but globally, actually. We're dealing with, if you like, a much more populist and tribal moment than we were in the 80s. How do you respond? How do you keep the arguments for personal autonomy and free competition going in an age where the momentum seems to be the other way?
Yeah, if you're comparing Ronald Reagan, the president, and Trump, the president, that's quite true. But back in the 1980s, the United States, the electorate, Congress, all the smart people were as terrified of Japan as they are now of China. Japan, because they had this government control run by smart people, which is how all the smart people in the United States think the economy should be run, by them. And they think in Japan they had that perfect plan where people who went to universities and got degrees would decide where to build steel mills. There was a great deal of protectionism, really destructive protectionism on chips and other things that really hurt the American economy a good deal. We have some of that now on behalf of steel and autos and different groups sort of being protected. I would argue that the business community is much more free trade. All of the structures, Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, every major trade association, every major company in the United States is for more open trade. Even the auto companies are more free trade than the president. So the rhetoric is sometimes odd. I mean, to hear a Republican president say that if you raise tariffs on trade from China to the United States, that China pays for that, not American consumers. And that's, with all politeness, that's nonsense. But he says it out loud, something Reagan would never have said. So there is the spokesman for the concept of protection, but I would argue that on the protectionist level itself, we had real problems that Reagan had to overcome. Deregulation is like protectionism within the borders of the United States. I mean, our advantage on free trade is we already have a free trade zone. It's called 330 million people living in a very large country that should have included Canada, but somebody did something wrong in 1812. But anyway, it's a very large country and a very large market. And that helps make the case for free trade in the reaction to the COVID-19 virus. We have had over 700 deregulatory moves that remove barriers between states. Medical doctors in New York want to go to Florida, they got to go through new tests or whatever, that's waived. nurses. You're allowed to move things across borders in terms of liquor and other regulatory regimes that have really come 700 plus. Now, some of those may snap back. I hope not. We've certainly made the case. But we've even had the virus say, you know what? We could get virus vaccines faster if we allowed British and Swiss and German universities to do testing for new viruses. And because their tests are as good as ours, let's take advantage of what they know, not say you have to do it again in the United States to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. There's federal legislation on this. There's real movement forward to deregulate as a reaction to the crisis. Matter of fact, this is the first crisis in American history where there's been more deregulation internal to the United States across state lines, across companies and professions and so on. It's been very, very cheerful on that level. And even those little Caligula laws where the governors get to say there's an emergency and they get to do whatever they want, they've crossed lines that will all be called back after this election. Legislators are waiting to pass legislation to say no governor in our state can ever do this again, and they're making a list of things that happen in other states. So we will actually have less annoying emergency laws, less dangerous emergency laws next year than we had 2 years ago and 20 years ago.
I'm sure that's right. I've noticed your colleagues at the Competitive Enterprise Institute have started the hashtag never needed whenever they talk about one of these laws. And what is very, very striking when you look at the hashtag never needed laws is how many of them were notionally introduced in the name of public health and yet were found to be worse than useless the moment that there was an actual health issue, that they were found to be deleterious to public health because, of course, the real reason they'd been proposed was something much more selfish than public health. I wonder if I can broaden this a little bit philosophically and come to Matthias. To make a generalization about the centre-right globally, we've tended to be culturally conservative and economically liberal compared to where the centre of gravity is. So we're in favour of patriotism and respect for established institutions and some control over national borders, but we're also in favour of free enterprise, free trade, free commerce. Sweden, until very recently, was the country that epitomised the opposite of that. It was ultra-liberal when it came to multiculturalism and mass migration and so on, but it was, until recently, very, very statist, high-tax, interventionist, and so on. And, of course, you've been shaped, if you like, in opposition to that model. Do you think, Matthias, that there is an intrinsic tension, maybe even an irresoluble one, between a conservative defense of homeland sovereignty and established institutions and a liberal economic desire to maximize personal opportunity and the free flow of goods and services?
Very interesting question. I don't believe that there's an intrinsic conflict that can't be solved. I think as a country, to be able to prosper, to be able to make your country great, you need to have a functioning economy. And for Sweden, as a Swedish patriot, I'm very much in favor of free trade because it's a necessity for Sweden as a country. We're a small country, very deeply dependent on export, and to be able to take care of our country and to nurture our landscapes and so forth, and to take care of the people who are weak in our society, we need trade, we need free trade, and that's essential. But then, of course, there is always some smaller issues where the conflict comes to light, and one of those are, for example, when it comes to some parts of agriculture, where the issues are connected to identity and values. In Sweden, we pride ourselves since several hundred years back to have a very strong animal defense, or to be very positive to taking care of animals and reduce suffering with animals. That's a part of our mentality and our culture and identity. And when we make free trade agreements with countries who have different rules and regulations regarding this, that makes it very hard for Swedish farmers to compete, and that leads to Swedish farmers closing down. In my area, for example, in the rural parts of Sweden, and that changes the landscapes that conservatives and patriots love, and that there is conflict there, of course. I think we should primarily focus on making free trade agreements regarding the things that we already agree on. And free trade is essential for every country, and especially for a country like mine. So it's impossible to be a Swedish patriot and not be positive to free trade, I think.
I mean, we are facing exactly that issue of agricultural standards. The UK is resuming control of its trade policy for the first time since 1972. And if you read our press, it is all about chlorinated American chicken and hormone-treated American beef. By chlorinated, they mean washed. They mean it's rinsed. I mean, there's more chlorine in a bag of salad. And yes, the beef is hormone treated, as is Australian beef, Brazilian beef, Argentine beef, in a way that the EU's own scientific body admits is not in any sense deleterious to human health. Those are very, very interesting examples of where something is being defended either on grounds of consumer protection or of animal welfare, where in reality, of course, it's a producer interest. But it sounds much easier and much nicer to say this is about the welfare of the animal than to say this is about my share of the market. And so everybody has learned how to use that language. I wanted to come, we have 15 or so minutes left, and I just wanted to come to the other huge issue that is shaking the world after these lockdowns, and possibly as an immediate consequence of them, which is this sudden rise in identity politics and this sense that where you stand on scraping away the physical signs of a country's history, its memorials and its monuments, the stories that are told in bronze and stone, defines you in one tribe or the other. And I survey a reasonably eloquent group of involved culture warriors in front of me, so I don't want to pass up the opportunity to get your take on it. I mean, Herman, you've been engaged in these culture wars in an intelligent way as a writer, long before it caught up with a lot of other politicians. And of course, in Spain, it has its own inflections. It's, let me put it like this: it would be bewildering to most non-Spaniards that so much of the last Spanish general election should have been taken up with an argument about whether to move Franco's body from the Valle de los Caídos. But these issues of which tribe you belong to seem to me to be dominating politics much more than they were a decade or two ago. And I wonder whether you think these are wars that we ought to be having, and as conservatives, whether they're wars that we can win.
Well, I think, we are specialists because we have we have in a very long war with Great Britain, with the English fleet. We have the Black Legion, which has followed us since the 16th century almost, in the sense of distorting the past for influencing the present. No, we have it a lot, but I think mainly now what is general to all Western civilization is that there is a globalism which wants to uproot societies, human beings more than societies. They want to uproot them and let's say kill this nexus to the identity, and they are afraid that they are assisting to a reaction. There has been a reaction. There is all over the Western world. We have a reactions against this kind of society without past, or with a manipulated past for progressive consumption, to say it swiftly. And so they have seen that there is a reaction, an identity reaction in the nations, and now they are pushing back. They are pushing hard to because they think it's now. Well, I wouldn't say now or never, but now it's an occasion for them. We see it in the States very, very, very strongly now with these occasions. I mean, they look for some pretext for having the people going over this, over everything what has been part of the identity and of the values of the societies that they want to break with. And we are seeing it all over the places. We are seeing in Spain they are distorting the past continuously in a ridiculous, almost in a ridiculous way. Sometimes you think on the next day someone is going to come up and say that the civil war was won by the communists. No, they will come, and there will be a moment where they will attempt to bring that to believe to the people. But in any case, I think it's sharpening because the globalism sees that the reaction of the nations is becoming stronger. And so I think we are entering a really enormous, tough cultural battle all over the Western world. And I think it's going to be increasingly tough, increasingly cruel, and maybe increasingly violent.
Thank you. Thank you. Eduardo, a similar question to you. In a way, Bolsonarism, if I can call it that, was kind of ahead of the curve, wasn't it? It's both by its opponents and its supporters. It's likened usually to Donald Trump, but I'm not sure that's quite right. I was struck in Brasilia by how many people said that the apter comparison is with Reagan rather than with Trump, because we're free marketeers and we're patriots, and we're in favor of an open economy. But I think it is probably fair to say that what is called populism has turned out to be a much more appealing electoral proposition than the older parties. Is that a fair caricature of what's happened in Brazil?
Yeah, if you talk about populism here in Brazil, it sounds not that good, because populism here, if you talk to a Brazilian, they're going to think that is a president that do whatever people wants and don't care about his responsibilities. I don't know if I make me understand, but I know that in Europe you have another sense of what it is populism. But in fact, here in Brazil, people say that Bolsonaro is the Trump from the tropicals. Pretty much because both of the presidents, they do not follow the politically correct. They think, they talk. They don't have any kind of filter to say, oh, I'm going to talk this in a politer way because I want to receive the support of this kind of people, you know. Maybe that's also why President Bolsonaro is always demanded in courts, people trying to say that he's racist, he's xenophobic, and all the other labels. But what you have to do is, if I can give advice to our friends here, you don't have to say that, oh, I'm not a Nazist. For sure you're not Nazist. Come on. Who is going to support a regime that killed more than 6 million Jewish? But if you look, the communists, they killed more than 100 million people only in 100 years. And they are attacking us because that. So everything is about the narrative, is about how you talk, the stories. And this is very bad. And as I said, we have a conservative president, but we don't have a conservative media or even a conservative party, a conservative university. So all the other fronts of this battle, we have to form conservatives to go there and explain to the people. And nowadays it's very hard to have a place to debate because you don't have debates anymore. You have attacks. When you say something about free market, they're going to you and say, oh, you only care about the money. You don't care about people's life. you say that, oh, I'm against the Black Lives Matter because they are burning stores. Even black people properties, they are burning. And they say, oh, you are racist. So this is very, very bad. Then that's why not only Brazil, for sure, pretty much the Western Hemisphere is polarized. But we have to keep going. We have more and more events like this one here where we can talk about our ideas, go to university, go to the radios, and try to do our best. Other way, we are going to be blamed for everything that happened.
Yes.
For example, only ended in Daniel, 30 seconds
Please.
more. For example, I'm sure that during the dry season of the Amazon forest, which starts around August and goes until November, this is the dry season of the Amazon forest. If you go to Europe and ask European, they're going to be sure that Amazon is on fire. But if you take a look, it's impossible. Not even if we want to burn the whole Amazon. Why? Because the Amazon forest, you have so much water there. You have 20% of the water that you can drink. It's in the Amazon area. It's impossible to burn it. But as we don't have a conservative media here, for sure the Europeans, they have the information about the left-wing media. That's why they can build in your conscience that Amazon is on fire. But in fact, it's impossible.
Yes, it's of course a well-known fact that there could not be any forest fires when Lula was president. They only began when Bolsonaro became president. But a very interesting point that you made there that I'll put to the others. This, of course, it's common to all our countries that if you diverge from the politically correct consensus, you're called a fascist, a Nazi, a racist. But the much more interesting thing is how many people call themselves socialists, and uncontroversially so, and get elected on that basis. And there's this extraordinary kind of double standard where capitalism is judged on its necessarily imperfect real world outcomes, but socialism uniquely gets a pass. It's never held to account for anything it's actually done. It's always treated only as a textbook theory. And whenever you say, but what about this or that, or what about Cuba, what about Venezuela, what about North Korea, oh, but those weren't socialist countries. Those were, real socialism has never been tried, right? And to see what an absurd statement that is, imagine making it about any other ideology. Imagine somebody saying, it's ridiculous to judge fascism by the genocidal 1930s regimes that called themselves fascists. Real fascism has never been. That would be seen for what it is, which is an absurd, self-serving argument. And yet the left constantly gets a pass on this. And let me come to you for a roundup on this, Grover. I wonder whether the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, of Donald Trump and so on, shows that, if you like, a tribal rightist response to that kind of double standard and an irritation at the sense of being talked down to, patronized, taken for granted, and taxed and regulated and lied to by people who despise your values and hold you in contempt, whether that is, if you like, stronger and alarmingly, from our point of view as free marketeers, than a classic liberal defense of personal autonomy and free inquiry.
People try and put those two in conflict, and certainly there are elected officials who want to do one thing and then they want to step away from a free market opportunity approach and just do it, mandate it, tariffs. But I would argue in the United States, our biggest strength is that those people who are conservative are also pro-freedom, because what they're trying to conserve is the Constitution, which is the roadmap to maintaining freedom. And rather than religious groups fighting, they all agree that there should be for religious liberty against state abuse and telling them what to do, closing down churches, synagogues, and mosques during the COVID. So it is very possible for Ronald Reagan or most Republicans to speak to conservatives, small c conservatives, who just want to be left alone to run their life. Well, that's what freedom is, okay? And That includes, I know the rest of the world doesn't get this, but it includes the 20 million Americans with a concealed weapons permit, so they can carry a gun on them at any time. It can, half the country is armed at any given point, and they want to be left alone with their freedoms. They tend to actually go to church, synagogue, and mosque as opposed to no one down the street, and they want to be left alone there. And we now have many, many more Americans who want to be left alone in their own jobs, in terms of people being self-employed, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, people setting up their own shop with Airbnb, a lot more self-employed people who simply wish to be left alone. And if you understand the center-right as a collection of groups that want to be left alone, people who homeschool in the United States, 2 million, people who go to private schools, a tenth of the student body, self-employed people, people who want to be left alone with their own profession, you get a functioning majority. That is why the left has to come in and say, no, we're going to divide everybody up by race and start poking people and trying to divide because they cannot win as we're the small group of people like to run everybody else's life and tell you what kind of light bulbs you can have and develop toilets that are too small to flush and things like that, and make you separate the green glass from the brown glass. That's not a winning strategy. You've got to have some other way to divide the electorate, which is why the Democratic Party has divided people, white, black, since slavery, since Jim Crow, since George Wallace, since affirmative action and quotas. They're always trying to divide people, and we have to overcome that by being the inclusive party, by pushing that away and saying, no, we're going to treat everybody the same.
Well, I wonder, there may be some transatlantic differences here. It may be that the Nordquists who sailed across the Atlantic and settled in North America were more keen on personal autonomy than the Nordquists who stayed in Scandinavia, and that there's an element of self-selection. But I wonder whether I could put the point that you just made to Matthias, because it's tempting, and I would love to believe that there is a majority of people who want to be left alone in any electorate, and that the desire for property rights and personal freedom ultimately is preponderant. But I wonder whether that's really true. We evolved in kin groups, in tribes. I think we, in many ways, are programmed to think communally. A lot of socialist ideology is sustained by these very old sort of Paleolithic senses of fairness and communal effort and endeavor. And at a time like this, when there's been maybe not a shared disaster, but a shared sense of threat and everyone together, I wonder whether that doesn't make us more authoritarian than in normal times. I hear of it in good and in bad ways, and I think Britain is probably not untypical. When the lockdowns came, it brought out a very good side of my neighbours. Suddenly people became very concerned to look out for each other and make sure that elderly people were getting their deliveries, and there was a terrific sense of shared purpose and community. But the flip side of that, of course, is it brought out the worst prissiness and bossiness and officiousness. We had police asking people if their journeys were really necessary, if they were buying luxurious goods that they didn't really need. One notorious case captured on film of somebody being told to get out of his own garden by a policewoman. So, and both of those, the good and the bad, if you like, are a retreat from liberalism. It's an elevation of the collective over the individual, a tribal sense. Do we need to adjust to that reality, at least in the short term? In Britain, one of the parallels that is often drawn during this whole coronavirus crisis is with the war and with the Blitz, and you have to be very careful making that parallel. But it's a good parallel in one sense. The government powers that were brought in on a supposedly contingent basis after 1940 then lasted way after the return of peace. So long after any conceivable justification, we had food rationing until 1954. We had identity cards until 1952. We had conscription until 1960. The state is very slow to return powers that were taken on a supposedly emergency basis. And I just wonder whether, like after 1945, the world may be in for a slightly more authoritarian spasm. And that therefore, if you like, the Trumpy rhetoric is apt to the mood of the times in a way that the old Reaganite, Thatcherite might not have been so effectively. Matthias, we're running out of time, so I will give you the last word.
Daniel,
Sorry, Grover, coming quickly, and then I'll come to you, Matthias.
I'm sorry. Daniel, the world may have heard when Rahm Emanuel, who used to be Obama's chief of staff, said, never let a crisis go to waste, and that you use it to augment the state. But that's an old saying. In 1794, 200 years ago, 1794, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Madison about the old trick of using every emergency as a way to augment state power.
Yeah.
So that argument's been around.
Yeah. Matthias, and then I'll ask anyone else who wants to come in. I'll come to you, Matthias, and then if any of the others want a final word, come in. So Matthias first.
Thank you very much. I think that there needs to be a parallel between a strong sense of community and a more authoritarian culture. I think you can have freedom and a strong sense of community at the same time. But I think that in America, protecting individualism is basically the same thing as protecting American culture, because the ethos of America is freedom and individual liberty. I think in this case of Sweden, it's a little bit more complex, and I think in Europe as a whole. So I think that maybe one of the reasons why classical liberals are losing out to more new forms of conservative movements who are more oriented towards patriotism is because people to the right have felt that someone needs to be standing up for the majority culture, for Western culture, because the left is attacking that. They're seeing a cultural revolution taking place where they want to basically get rid of everything that people traditionally have cherished. And it goes to family, it goes to market economy, it goes to traditions and customs that many people still love, but the left wants to totally get rid of. And so in that sense, I think there's no way of avoiding this cultural conflict that the left has brought upon us. And what the left is doing is they try to just create everyone's war against each other, dividing people, black, white, homosexual, heterosexuals, men, women, in order to divide and conquer. But we need to stand up together, and I think we need to, in that sense, stand up for something that is community and fellowship and tradition. I think that classical liberals, libertarians, and conservatives and patriots have a common goal in that sense, because they won't stop at statues. They will also go for market economy and free trade in the end.
Yes, thank you. It is very striking that if you look at which statues are being targeted, this is not an argument about slavery. No. When they are targeting in Parliament Square Winston Churchill, the original Antifa, Robert Peel, who is the reason why we have unarmed police. Abraham Lincoln, the American guest may be surprised to learn that a big statue of Abraham Lincoln stands in Parliament Square. When Black Lives Matter are targeting Abe Lincoln on both sides of the Atlantic, you realize that this is not about slavery or racial injustices. Or my particular favorite was the attack on the memorial in Boston to the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. I mean, something from the 1860s, so probably racist. Let's just smash it just to be on the safe side. We're dealing with something that is much more Maoist, much more about erasing the sense of self. John Locke said that human self-identity consists in memories, and I think he was right. I think he was anticipating modern psychology. He understood that what we mean by self-identity is our ability to remember past situations from the same perspective. If an individual is defined by memory, a nation is defined by history. And when you efface that history, you leave the nation like an individual with amnesia or with severe Alzheimer's, helpless and lost. Would anyone like to come in and have the final word before I hand back to Richard?
Excellent final word.
I vote for Herman Tersch to have the final word.
Go on, Herman.
It was an excellent final word, but I will only say that we had a recent attack some days ago, and that will be especially for Dan it has a special significance because he's very much fond of bullfighting. And so we had, among all these assaults on monuments, we had here some assaults, of course, from the left against bullfighting, and they went against bullfighters, and they found one who has a monument in front of the bullfighting arena in Madrid, who is called Dr. Fleming.
Yes.
And they sprayed with graffiti. They made a graffiti killer. They called Dr. Fleming, the one who discovered the penicillin. They called him killer. So I think we have mostly, and we saw it in England as well. We have much to do with ignorance as well. There is hate, but there is an amount of ignorance to mobilize, and that's what the left always wants.
What a very good note to end on. Yes, it's very true. For the majority of non-aficionado viewers, in a lot of Spanish bull rings, there will be a statue outside of a local matador who was a hero. But outside Las Ventas in Madrid, very unusually, is a statue that was actually paid for by public subscription among the toreros. So not raised by the state, not raised by the town council, but paid for by the actual professionals. And of course, they knew exactly who mattered to them. It is not a bullfighter who's honored, it's the inventor of penicillin. And it's a very, very beautiful statue of a matador raising his hat in salute to the man who saved all of the lives of so many of them who needed blood transfusions in the 20th century. And if you have a crowd attacking Dr. Fleming, then they are attacking reason and science, as well as the national identity of Spain. So I think that we can all agree on a defense not only of our national traditions, but of the empirical method and of the truth. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to Philip, thank you to Matthias, thank you to Grover, to you, Herman, and to you, Eduardo. It's very kind of you all to come in from your respective countries, and I will hand back to Richard Milsom of the ECR Party.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to all of you. Thank you, Dan, Herman, and Matthias, as our regular panelists on these webinars. And a special note of thanks to our American cousins, Philip and Grover, and particularly to Eduardo. Thank you so much for joining us for the first time. Actually, there were a lot of questions that came in, a lot of them to do with the Amazon rainforest. And as ECR Party is very actively engaged in proposing free market and entrepreneurial solutions to climate change problems, we would love to have you over here in Brussels when you're able to travel to come and set the record straight.
It would be my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for the questions. It's a very interesting debate. Just one final note. Next week, we are on the future of 5G, international competition without tariffs. And we're going to be joined by General James Jones from the US, Congressman Robert Alderholt, and we're also partnering with Export USA. So that should be a very interesting and lively webinar for next week. But just to say thank you very much to all of you. We've had almost over 1,000 people watching us online, and wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next one.
Ya hemos pasado.
Muy bien. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you to all of you. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. All the best. Thank
Eduardo,
you.
Matisse.